Introduction to an index. So what is this index? As you study most likely statistics, but you possibly could run into indices. So indices is just plural, and index just means a singular one. If you're studying sometimes maybe business or sciences, maybe you're going to be talking about this index. I think it's worthwhile to be exposed to this at some point in high school or later on, or maybe earlier even, if you get lucky. Now, as you study statistics, you'll notice that you will be presenting the data, all the collection, and then as you organize items and so on, you utilize certain graphs for this. Now, this particular graph is basically a set of data points plotted and then just connected all the way through, so it kind of looks like a polygon graph of some kind. Now, you don't really know what the y-axis represents. The x-axis, you can probably figure out that it's a timeline, so it is time, and you can see their years, and it's also kind of marked off as months. So this particular graph is actually of the Consumer Price Index. So it's in short CPI, okay, which you might run into, and certainly as you become a little bit older, you might be interested in, not just for studying, but to actually see what happens to inflation, so how much your money is capable of buying. And I'm going to try to explain through this example actually what an index is, and then I'll also reference back kind of where you might see these indices. So you can see clearly that this graph is going up. It's not really a straight line. It's not a nice kind of a function that we might think of if you were studying functions, because it's kind of rugged and zigzag and so on. It does have moments where it goes down. Okay, and then as time goes on, you can see that steadily just keeps climbing. Okay, so from I guess the kind of 2009 or maybe even 2008 all the way to 2014 there. Okay, there's a steady climb in here. On the y-axis, it looks like there's just some numbers, but you might think, I don't really know what that represents. Okay, so what are these numbers for? And I'll try to explain that in just a moment. Now, the index is actually referenced back to the year of 2002, where it says that it was set at 100. So it's kind of like a reference point, or a base, kind of a number, okay, or a starting point that we can compare to. And that's exactly what an index does. It tries to show you a comparison. So we can clearly see that based from 2002, okay, if it was set at 100, and now it's almost at 126, that it has risen, about 26% over time. And if you do understand what a consumer price index is, then you know that the representation, okay, so this 100 at the time and the 126 now, has something to do with us as consumers, so hence the consumer, and then P, which is for the price, so that number has something to do with a price. And the word index is actually, just one singular number, which summarizes maybe numerous data points. So I will come back to this in just a moment because I'll show you where it comes from. But an index in general, is indeed just a summary. You can think of it almost as an average. You know that if you're going to be measuring a set of data points or maybe some kind of a variable, and you have numerous points, but you don't really want to have that set. Maybe you're measuring mass, maybe you're measuring temperature, maybe pressure, maybe money, okay? Over time, and you have, let's say, 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 or maybe even more data points, you can very nicely capture it in a singular number, which might be an average. And then that average is a representation of all those data points. So an index works very similarly, where you have a set of numbers or set of measurements or maybe observation or rules, as I point out here. So you have different observations or possibly rules, or maybe huge amounts of measurements, and all of this is creating a data set for you. And now you're going to be taking that data set, and what you want out of that data set is you want just one singular number to represent all this data set. And it will have some meaning for you based on the observations and rules and measurements that you create. So for instance, okay, with respect to this graph, the data set is actually all the prices of all the consuming items that we have. Now, what do we consume as individuals? Of course, we all consume different things, but there's always a basket of goods, okay, that we can look at that most people do utilize. So, basket of goods within food, we utilize transportation, we have to pay for our living costs, okay, so in terms of maybe heating and gas, okay, and water and so on, okay, paying for our rent or maybe our mortgages, okay. So we have all of these different goods, okay, that we actually have to consume in order to carry on. And they all have set of prices. And then what happens is that a government body, okay, of some kind, or sometimes it is being consulted out, okay, will check what is happening to this basket of goods over time. Now, of course, we can individually see and we can individually graph each item, right? And then what happens to, let's say, if you're buying your coffee, what is happening to the price of coffee over time, and you can see that very clearly and graph it just as we have here. But we can also take the entire basket of goods, from our coffees, to our vegetables, to sometimes if we're eating out, so what's the cost of a dinner eating out, okay? How much is gas costing us, or maybe energy if we're using electric cars, okay, and so on and so on. And now we have all of these items, and instead of graphing all of them and trying to see what is happening, we kind of want to have an overall average, okay, or what we like to call kind of an index-based idea of, okay, what is happening overall to these products in general. Now, this is just one index or one average that we're taking because I'm talking about the consumer prices. But, okay, all of these actually happen all over the place. So it doesn't have to be with items in general. It can be in sciences with respect to what is happening, for example, in terms of temperatures over time, and then maybe those temperatures are dependent on certain things. And then you're creating an index, some number based on some observations and rules and measurements that is creating some index for temperatures over time. Okay, or maybe what's happening to the climate over time. Okay, or maybe what is happening to the use of items over time, or maybe popularity. Even you can have indices in terms of kind of social behavior of human beings. So we have these indices all over. So they can happen in business, right? They can happen in sciences, okay, in economics and many other fields as well. So for this, okay, just to let you know, come back to this CPI, Consumer Price Index, I kind of looked up. So, I went on the web and I went on a kind of a government site. This one is actually from the US. And it nicely captures for us what this Consumer Price Index actually constitutes. So here on the left-hand side, what you see there, okay, so it says, we have all items, and it is actually in 2022. So depending on when you're going to be watching this, it will obviously maybe possibly change because the government bodies might change our index and what constitutes. So notice it says it has all items, and I'm only going to look at that first column down. I'm not going to look where you see July and June and all of those comparisons. Okay, I'm looking at just that one singular column where it says all items and then it says 100. What that represents is actually 100%, meaning all items that are included in our basket to create kind of our average or our index, so that one number, okay, is going to be constituting of all of these things. And you can see there. So food, okay, is 13.372% of that entire basket of goods. And within that food, it's also broken down into, okay, so food at home, so things that we consume at home, is about 8.295%. And then if you scroll down there, you also see food away from home, right, which is 5.077%, which means just food that we're eating out and that maybe we're purchasing on the go, okay? And then it's broken down, okay, even further. So you have cereals and bakery products, meat, poultry, fish and eggs, dairy, fruits and vegetables, and so on. So this is just one basket of under food, and out of that 100%, it constitutes about 13.372%. And then you move on. What else is in our basket that we consume? Well, there's obviously energy. So energy in terms of, so it says commodities, okay, so things that we're using like fuel oil, motor oil, so it's kind of like gasoline, okay, that we will have. Various energy services, so electricity, utilities, so gas, okay. And that should make sense to you because we need that either to heat our homes or maybe cool our homes or just maintain them as they are, and then also to utilize it for maybe transportation. And then you have all kinds of other items, okay, within here. Okay, so from items that we have, you see there is apparel, new vehicles, used cars and trucks. Doesn't mean that you're buying vehicles all the time, okay, but this index, okay, assumes that some people, okay, will be buying their vehicles, okay, so either new or used, and also you want to see what is happening to the price of those. And it just tells you what percentage of our entire basket is consumed by that. And you can keep going, and then as you go through, you can even break down even the smallest of items, okay, but you notice that this is a huge data set. Like if we had to collect this and graph what is happening to, apparel, and we would see what is happening over time, that's great, but then we would have to do that for every single individual thing, which is fine if you're interested in one area. But if you want a summary of the whole thing, then you just create an index. So these just become the inputs, basically to like a function, kind of like an average function. And then that average function is going to calculate based on these weights. So notice it has a weight, okay, by percentage. So it weighs all the prices accordingly by the percent that we have given it in the basket. So food, for example, is going to get 13.372%. It's going to get weighed. How much does it cost? And then it's going to spit out for you, basically like a function, an output. And that output is just a singular number. And then we have just that one number for that 1 month or that 1 year to see what has happened to the prices overall. And then, of course, we can graph it. And then that's what you see here. So what it was saying is that in 2002, when we took this entire basket, we basically normalized it to 100, which is kind of like, what does $100 buy you at the moment? So you would think of it as the y-axis is kind of like the number, the index is kind of like money, at least for this example. It doesn't have to be for all. And the normalized number, so the base number, is 100. And that's a comparison. So in that comparison that we would have, okay, we would now compare. So instead of looking at all of these items individually, it's much nicer to just look at one number, which is the consumer price index, and then see, what is happening. Well, so as you can see over time here, as it keeps rising, and it's about 125 or 126 there, about 2014, so it's a few years back. That is now telling you that in 2002, okay, for the basket of goods, you would pay $100. But in 2014, to buy the same thing, you would need to buy, okay, or you need to pay $125 or $126. And that is now comes to this word of inflation, right? Where we can actually kind of see, oh, okay, well, we have to pay more for the same items that we had before. And in 2022, okay, kind of history books will show that we had huge inflation where these prices kept rising for exactly the same items. And that's not always a good thing for us, okay, because we obviously have to pay more, and sometimes we're going to have to either work more, okay, if we're lucky, or we're going to have to see what costs we're going to be cutting somewhere else. So that's a consumer price index, right? But you can do that index for anything. So wherever you hear this word index or indices, okay, which is plural if there are many of them, okay, so that index just simply represents based on some observations, some rules, some measures for the CPI, Okay, the observations, rules, and measures are based on the foods and things we consume. Okay, energy, transportations, and so on. Okay, we create the rules, so we create maybe some weighing factors, what we think is important is not, and then we take the measurements. For CPI, it's just like how much do these things cost. Now we have a data set. That data set is now fed into a function, right? So some kind of a calculation that then outputs one singular number, an index. So it's an index to all of these observation, rules, and measures. Okay, and it's just one singular number. And it's a very quick comparison, okay, for a variable, or as you see, maybe many variables, because we took many items in our basket, so that you can see what is happening over time. So an index is always pretty much given where the x-axis is time, and then the y-axis is the index itself. And you have to know what the rules sometimes are, but sometimes you don't. Because in here, if I look at this, I don't need to know how they've created this consumer price index. I just can see that it's rising, sometimes a little bit faster, sometimes a little bit slower. And if I understand what the consumer price is, meaning the prices we buy, okay, things for, I do understand that, it looks like to buy the same things, I'm going to have to start paying more and more, which of course, over history of time, it shows that this happens, unless eventually, we collapse, and then maybe we'll have deflation where things are going to be costing less because people are just going to be in trouble, people won't have work, and so on. So we wouldn't be able to charge the same thing for the same items, and maybe you'll see dips. Okay, instead of it going up, maybe there will be a period where it starts to go down. That down would be called a deflation. Now, one of the most common indices, or an index which I love to look at is kind of stock market and try to understand the stock market itself. If you look at anything to do with the stock market, maybe, if you're in high school, you're not interested yet. But as time goes on, maybe you should. I always look at that index, and it's a reflection of how businesses are doing. And the index just tells us what people are willing to pay for kind of companies that are traded on the stock exchange. And you have a huge amount of companies, and then again, you'll have some observation, rules, and measurements, and then an index is created, some one number, and you can see it going up or down. If it's going up, that means people value companies more. If it's coming down, well, they're not willing to pay as much for those companies. And as you know, these indices just kind of start going up, and then sometimes it goes down for quite a while. People think like, oh my gosh, I've lost money. Okay, but ultimately it is just a reflection of what the public is willing to pay for companies in a basket, of companies which are represented by some index. I actually did a video on that, and if you're interested, I think it's worthwhile. Okay, I'll put up a link up above there. It is with respect to index funds. I explain what an index is with respect to the stock market, and then also what a fund is, and it ties in to this. All right, so I think that this should be enough for you in terms of an introduction to indices, and I think either in statistics or at some point somewhere else you're going to run into these indices, and it will be worth your time to understand what they are. Now they're just a reflection, so once you start knowing and seeing more graphs, especially where the x-axis is in a time scale, then these will be easier to understand. All right, so I hope that this gave you a nice introduction to kind of an index, and that you can see these things, in kind of a visual way. And by the way, the index that you see was actually a Canadian index, and in here, so maybe I'll go back, this was, where I found these results, and this is exactly from the Canadian, website, as you can see there. So that is, an index which was created there. All right, so that's all. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in a future video. Bye, everybody.